For the first 3 days of testimony, jurors heard about the crime scene, the autopsy, the DNA evidence, and the injuries that ended Grace Jennings' life. But on day 4, the focus shifted this time. The prosecution didn't begin with bloodstains or forensic science. Instead, they opened a cell phone. Inside that phone, investigators said they found conversations they believe reveal what happened before Grace was killed. Messages, photographs, Facebook accounts, and words the prosecution argues point directly toward planning. The defense, however, disputes the prosecution's interpretation of that evidence. What those digital conversations actually prove will ultimately be decided by the jury. We're breaking down exactly what jurors saw and why day 4 could become one of the most important days of this entire trial. Welcome back to MF True Crime. Today, as court resumed, the prosecution called one of its most significant witnesses back to the stand, Santa Fe Police Sergeant Javier Vigil. Unlike many earlier witnesses, Vigil wasn't describing only one piece of evidence. He was responsible for helping assemble the investigation itself. Over months, detectives collected surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, searched electronic devices, executed search warrants, and pieced together hundreds of individual details. Now, jurors were about to see how many of those pieces fit together. The prosecution began by turning to digital evidence. Not speculation, not opinion. Actual messages recovered during the investigation. For much of the morning, jurors heard about 2 Facebook Messenger accounts. One investigators associated with Isaac Apodaca, the other with Kiara McCulley. According to Sergeant Vigil's testimony, detectives linked the account using the username nullvoid to Isaac through the investigation. The account identified as Froggy was associated with Kiara. Those accounts became important because investigators recovered conversations exchanged between them before Grace Jennings was killed. The prosecution argues those conversations provide insight into the relationship between Isaac and Kiara, as well as events leading up to the homicide. The defense has challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the digital evidence and is expected to continue doing so as the trial progresses. For now, jurors were asked to focus on the messages themselves. Not conclusions, just the evidence. Then, the courtroom became noticeably quieter. Prosecutors displayed one message after another. Among them, a message that has already attracted significant public attention. According to evidence presented in court, one message read, "A getting sword." By itself, the sentence is brief. But prosecutors argue it becomes much more significant when viewed alongside other evidence already presented during the trial. Jurors previously heard testimony that a 36-inch sword had been delivered to the McCulley property the day before Grace Jennings was killed. Laney McCulley testified that Kiara opened the package in front of her and that multiple family members handled the sword after it arrived. Now, the prosecution is asking jurors to consider whether the Facebook messages fit into that broader timeline. The defense disputes the prosecution's interpretation and has not conceded that the messages establish criminal planning. That question remains for the jury. Throughout the morning, prosecutors carefully guided Sergeant Vigil through additional messenger conversations recovered during the investigation. Rather than rushing through dozens of messages, they slowed down, one by one, allowing jurors to read each exchange for themselves. This strategy wasn't accidental. Unlike eyewitness testimony, digital conversations don't rely on memory years later. Jurors could see the wording, the timestamps, and the sequence of the exchanges exactly as they were preserved during the investigation. But digital evidence also raises difficult questions. Who wrote each message? Were the accounts being used by the people investigators believe? Can a short text message reveal intent? Those are questions both sides are expected to address before the trial ends. By lunchtime on day 4, the prosecution had shifted the trial away from forensic science and directly into the digital lives of the people at the center of this case. Jurors had seen Facebook Messenger conversations, heard testimony explaining how investigators connected those accounts, and were introduced to messages prosecutors argue are critical to understanding what happened before Grace Jennings was killed. But the most dramatic testimony of the day was still to come. After the break, Jurors would hear recorded interview clips, watch detectives confront Isaac Apodaca with the evidence, and learn why prosecutors believe his own statements may contradict parts of his defense. For most of the trial, jurors had been hearing about Isaac Apodaca through detectives, through forensic experts, through witnesses. But after lunch on day 4, that changed. This time, they weren't listening to someone describe Isaac's statements. They were listening to Isaac himself. Every pause, every answer, every denial. For prosecutors, this wasn't just another interview. They believed these recordings would allow jurors to compare Isaac's own explanations with the evidence already introduced in court. The defense, however, maintains that Isaac's statements must be considered in full and alongside all of the evidence not viewed in isolation. And as the recording began, the courtroom fell silent. Months before this trial ever began, detectives sat across from Isaac Apodaca and started asking questions, not just about Grace Jennings, but about his relationship with Kiara McCulley, the messages investigators had recovered, and the events surrounding the homicide. On day 4, prosecutors played portions of that recorded interview for the jury. Sergeant Javier Vigil remained on the witness stand to provide context for the recording and explain where it fit within the broader investigation. As the interview unfolded, detectives confronted Isaac with evidence they had gathered during the investigation. Sometimes they asked direct questions. Sometimes they compared his answers with digital records already recovered. The jury wasn't simply hearing a conversation. They were watching investigators test a version of events against the evidence they had collected. The digital conversations introduced earlier in the day returned to the center of the courtroom. Detectives questioned Isaac about messages that prosecutors contend were exchanged through Facebook accounts investigators associated with him and Kiara McCulley. Some questions focused on the wording, others focused on timing. Investigators wanted jurors to see how those conversations fit into the sequence of events they had reconstructed. Isaac disputed aspects of the prosecution's interpretation and offered explanations during the interview. That distinction matters. The jury has heard the prosecution's theory. The defense disputes that theory and will have the opportunity to challenge those conclusions during its case. For now, the messages remained open to interpretation. But prosecutors were asking jurors to look beyond individual texts. They wanted them to see a pattern. A homicide investigation rarely depends on one piece of evidence. Instead, detectives build a timeline. One message becomes 2. One phone record is compared with another. Witness testimony is measured against digital records. According to Sergeant Vigil's testimony, investigators followed that process throughout this case, comparing electronic evidence with interviews and other investigative findings. The prosecution argues that when those pieces are viewed together, they support its theory of the case. The defense argues that the same evidence can be interpreted differently and does not establish guilt. That disagreement now sits at the heart of this trial. Before jurors ever heard these recordings, they had already become the subject of a legal battle. The defense argued they should be excluded. Prosecutors argued they were important evidence. The judge ultimately ruled that edited portions of the calls could be played. When the recordings were played, jurors heard Isaac continue to deny responsibility for Grace Jennings' death. He challenged aspects of the investigation and maintained his innocence. Prosecutors argue that portions of those statements differ from other evidence presented during trial. The defense argues the recordings reflect a man consistently denying involvement and should not be interpreted as evidence of guilt. The recordings do not decide the case. They become one piece of evidence among many that jurors will evaluate before reaching a verdict. By the end of day 4, the prosecution had done something different. Instead of relying primarily on forensic experts, they invited jurors into the investigation itself. They saw how detectives traced online accounts, how they analyzed digital conversations, how they questioned a suspect, and how prosecutors believe those pieces fit together. But the trial is far from over. The defense has not yet presented its witnesses. Cross-examination continues. Additional evidence is still expected, and the jury has not reached any conclusions. Every piece of evidence introduced so far must ultimately be weighed against everything still. Day 4 wasn't remembered because of dramatic courtroom outbursts. It was remembered because the investigation became personal. Jurors didn't just hear what detectives believed. They watched investigators confront the evidence and listened as Isaac Apodaca responded in his own words. Whether those responses strengthen the prosecution's case or reinforce the defense's position is a question only the jury can answer. As the trial continues, more witnesses, more digital evidence, and more testimony are expected to shape what may become one of the most closely watched murder cases in New Mexico. We'll continue following every day of this trial here on MF True Crime, bringing you evidence-based coverage, separating fact from allegation, and breaking down the testimony so you can understand what happened inside the courtroom. If you found this recap helpful, subscribe to MF True Crime, turn on notifications, and join us for Day 5, where the next chapter of this case begins. Because sometimes, the most important evidence isn't found at the crime scene. It's found in the conversations people never expected anyone else to hear.